Welcome to this continuing series from Washington Policy Center, our virtual solutions series. My name is David Bose. I'm the Communications Director for Washington Policy Center. I can tell you that this is probably our biggest virtual solution series yet in terms of the number of guests. We have Senator John Braun, Representative Mike Chapman, Representative J.T. Wilcox, Representative Brandon Vick, Representative Andrew Barkis, plus our three Center directors, Jason Mercier, Todd Myers, and Mariya Frost. So we have a jam-packed panel discussion going on today, and the topic is remembering the role of the legislative branch during the COVID-19 pandemic. So we'll be getting into that in just a moment. First, a couple of announcements. One, I want to recognize the passing of former U.S. Senator Slade Gorton. He was a towering figure in Washington politics and a wonderful supporter to Washington Policy Center. On a personal note, my wife worked with him as the conservative liaison, and he was always quite charming and friendly and an intelligent and gracious individual. So our hearts go out to him, and I can only hope that that all of us are as active and mentally agile as Senator Gorton was at the age of 92. So our respects to his passing. I'd also like to alert you to the Washington Policy Center webpage, where you can see the latest from Dr. Roger Stark. Dr. Roger Stark released his new book yesterday, Healthcare Policy Simplified. His book aims at making healthcare policy easy to understand, not just the small component that each of us see as we interact with the healthcare system, but from a broad kind of bird's eye perspective, the complicated nature of U.S. healthcare policy, how it got to where it is today, and where it should be. It's brand new. It's on Amazon. You can get the link at washingtonpolicy.org. And our next virtual solutions series event will be with Dr. Stark. That date will be announced, so be watchful of that. Now, a couple of things about how this event is going to work today. Very shortly, I'll disappear, and the panelists will kind of take over. They'll have their conversation, and then I will come back on to moderate a Q&A portion of this event. You can ask questions in the question panel. It's on the right-hand side of your control panel for your GoToWebinar toolbox there. You can ask it in that little function. There should be a chat function or a question function right there on the right-hand side of your toolbar, or you can email it to me directly at D as in David, B as in boy, O, Z as in zebra, E as in egg, dbose at washingtonpolicy.org if you prefer it old school and you want to email me directly. I'll be collecting those questions as the panel continues, and then at the end, we'll bring everybody back on, all cameras be on, Brady Bunch style, and we'll have a Q&A section for the last, a half to a third of the program. So with that, I'd like to call to the screen Jason Mercier, our Center for Government Reform Director, to begin and introduce his panel. Jason, welcome.
Morning, Dave. You know, we are now 6 months into this global pandemic, and we have seen the executive branch and the judicial branch be allowed to exercise their constitutional roles. But perhaps the most important branch, the people's legislative body, the legislative branch, has been frozen out of responding not only to the decisions being made for all Washingtonians, but its constitutional role on appropriations and the budget. Now, if you listen to the governor, you may not realize that Washington is currently facing a $4.5 billion budget deficit in the current budget, and that's almost $9 billion over 3 years. This is something you would expect and desire to see the legislature respond to, but the governor's made it clear he's not going to call a special session. So to help us talk a little bit about why it is so important for that co-equal branch of government to be involved, we have three lawmakers joining us today: Senator Braun, Representative Chapman, and Representative Wilcox. And they're going to share some thoughts on why it is so critical for them to be allowed to do their job and represent you as Washingtonians. So this time we're going to go ahead and turn it over to Senator Braun, one of the lead budget writers in the Senate, to give us an update on what's happening. Senator Braun.
Well, thank you, Jason. Let me try and get my webcam to work here. So we only have a few minutes, and I'm being a budget guy. What I'm hoping to do is just give you a quick math lesson, right? You mentioned $4.5 billion shortfall in this biennium, $9 billion over the next 3 years. We know we just start with that math. $4.5 billion. We got to solve that problem. in the next year. We got about $3 billion in restricted and unrestricted reserves. So that brings our problem down to $1.5 billion. We got to solve before June 30th of next year. And we are sitting on our hands. We're not doing anything about it. If we had acted as many folks on the Republican side of the aisle have suggested in June, we could have stopped $1 billion in new spending. We also believe we could use some of the federal stimulus money, the FMAP money, to cover about $500 million in expected spending. Math's easy. We just solved the problem for this year. Now that doesn't mean we solved the whole problem. We still have $4.5 billion of shortfall in the next biennium. Well, we've given ourselves some runway to figure that out. Instead, what we're doing is we're just sitting on our hands. We're doing nothing. We're hoping that the federal government borrows or prints more money and sends it our way. That's a whole different discussion that we may want to have at some point, but it's not likely to happen, basically. If you look at where we're at federally, I don't think it's likely to happen, but we're going to sit on our hands right now. If the governor and the majority have their way, we won't come into special session until January. And what that means is if we're in special session in January, the soonest we likely have any kind of solution to this problem is March, maybe April. So now you still have the $1.5 billion problem. Let's just say you could still solve, $500 million with federal money, which it's not clear you could if you wait that long. But let's just say you could. You still have $1 billion problem in 3 months. All right. To do that, you have to have $4 billion per year in new taxes. That's $8 billion of new taxes over 2 years. This is if you think tax is a solution. The same applies if you want to do cuts. There's no way to get there. It just can't, it's virtually impossible. That means we either have, record-breaking new taxes that will crush our economy, or we put cuts in place that will be devastating to social services around the state. And that's what we're doing. Yes, go ahead.
Your camera is not on.
All right, well, try that. Oh,
There
it's
you
on.
go.
I'll just wrap up. I'm going to be pretty brief. I mean, we're faced with a tough problem, admittedly, but a problem we could solve if we are just willing to come into session and work on it. And it's simple math. And it's like the governor and the majority either aren't paying attention or they don't get simple math. And I don't think I think they understand math. And I assume they're paying attention, but right now it doesn't look like that. And the consequences will be, as I said, devastating both for our economy if they choose new taxes, or for our social services if we reduce spending. So thanks for the opportunity to be here. I look forward to questions. Back to you.
Great, thank you, Senator Braun. And we will have the questions at the end, and we'll have the camera there so we can see Senator Braun address those. Now, the calls for a special session have been bipartisan. And in fact, we did a survey of lawmakers and found that there are at least 51 representatives wanting the legislature to act in a special session right now. And among those is Representative Chapman, who has consistently been asking the governor to allow the legislature to come back in so he can represent the needs of his district. Representative Chapman, at this time, I'd like to invite you to bring on your camera and give us an update about what's happening for you and why a special session is necessary. Do we have you there, Representative Chapman? There we are.
Can't hear you.
Minority member of my party calling for a special session. I'll just add that I think Senator Braun did a great job. I think I'll add that it's surprising to me that so many advocates who are consistently asking to make sure that the state government funds programs are so strangely silent. If you look at the Seattle Times editorial, and if we know we'd have started in June, we would have had a much smaller, we had a much better ability to control our spending and the budget cuts that are coming. By waiting until January, which I'm now absolutely convinced we will not be meeting until January. And I'll add, I'm doubtful the governor will actually have us meet in January, so that's going to be a whole nother issue. But we're going to have like 28 to 30% budget cuts. So those folks who consistently advocate for increased government spending have been strangely silent while they're watching the budget be obliterated. And that's been the surprise to me. And I think that during a pandemic, if there was ever a time for a bipartisan budget agreement, this should be it. And I think we could have had a bipartisan budget agreement to amend our budget, to adjust it so that the cuts would not have been as draconian as they're now inevitably going to be. You'll never be able to raise revenue to bring back that kind of a size of budget cut. So it's an interesting time. I don't like being classified as I think the governor used a phrase, unnecessary or essential workers and non-essential. And in essence, the legislature has now been told we're non-essential workers. And I don't think that's fair to our constituents. I don't think it's fair to those legislators who are working hard, trying to work hard on their constituency, but have no voice in how the state's being run right now. So.
Great. Thank you, Representative Chapman. I appreciate you joining us this morning. Representative Chapman mentioned how the legislature has somewhat been deemed non-essential by the governor at this point by not bringing them back in. And we're in a situation where essentially one person is making a decision for over 7 million Washingtonians by not allowing the legislative body to meet. You would hope at least the legislative leadership's been included in some of this decision-making, but as we'll hear from House Minority Leader Representative Wilcox, that hasn't necessarily been the case. At this time, Mr. Wilcox, I'd love to have you come on and let us know what is happening and what should be happening right now for the state.
Well, thank you so much, Jason, for putting this on and giving the legislature a voice. One of the things that people may not realize is, well, the governor has an immense megaphone right now because he can call press availability and people are quite interested in what he has to say. The legislature doesn't have a megaphone at all. We have a different set of ethics rules, and we are not even allowed at this point to make official statements using our staff or any public resources because every single member of the House is up for election right now. And there is a process to ask for permission. We've worked that in a tiny number of cases after our statements have been heavily modified by Ethics Council. I didn't use the word censored there, but essentially we have no megaphone at all. And for people that take their job seriously, as every member of the House Republicans, and I think the same thing is true for the House Democrats, that is a heavy blow to not really have this important branch of government allowed to have any voice at all. Now, a lot of my friends know that I'm a recovering CFO, and I was a CFO during some pretty hard times. In fact, I was CFO at one point when our business, which was a sizable business, was in the workout phase. And boy, do you learn about hard times when you're being supervised by a banking group that is ready to pull the plug if for one moment you begin to overpromise and underdeliver. And that is what we're facing, I think, in the state of Washington. And I've told this to some advocates. I'm so glad that Representative Chapman mentioned that in many cases, the people that are either silent or are having Zoom meetings with legislative leadership telling us how important their sector is and asking us to not touch them with cuts. I just wish that they understood the situation a little bit better. I have told them, we had a recent GNP report where our national GNP was down 30%. When the economy is down 30%, there is no way to replace that activity in a way that will allow the public sector to preserve all of the spending that has been occurring. Maybe a little bit different at the national level, and for the time being at least, they can use the Fed. But at the state level, we don't have that ability. So we are looking at a decidedly smaller economy to provide the revenues that are necessary to operate the state. And I don't think that that economy is coming back really fast, especially in the states that have created the greatest obstructions to rebuilding the economy. And so this isn't really an argument about priorities. It should be an argument about, what is happening to the basic building block of public revenues. And I don't think that the private sector in the long run is going to be very interested in making even greater sacrifices while they are down to preserve and make whole the public sector. So that's my message to advocates that are not talking to the governor and the majority caucuses about bringing us back so that we can make the corrections that Senator Braun mentioned. I also want to say we have some very creative budget writing brains. In fact, I would say that Representative Stokesbury and Senator Braun are perhaps the two most creative thinkers in Olympia. And to not have them be part of the solution is an immense mistake. Now, I have seen that Senator Billig, the Senate Majority Leader, has said that he expects that there could be a special session in November. I think that's a terrible message to send to others, that we're not going to take care of this because it's an election season, but maybe we will come back and do our job after the consequences of our actions are eliminated. So I would really call on everybody, let's come back. It's inconvenient. It means that incumbents can't fundraise for their election, but our jobs and our responsibility to the people of Washington should come first.
Great, thank you, Representative Wilcox. And that's happening across the country. California met in a special session in June and balanced its budget. Oregon did the same just a few weeks ago, and states across the country are doing the responsible thing of remembering the role of the legislature and allowing lawmakers to act. Now, if that's not going to happen, there is a requirement. State law does require the governor to issue across-the-board cuts, but he's chosen not to do that either. The situation needs to change, and one of the ways it needs to change when lawmakers come back in is to allow the economy to reopen and people to find jobs through new innovative ways through occupational licensing reform. And to bring us more information on that, I'm going to bring in Todd Myers, our Director of Environmental Policy, who knows a lot about occupational licensing, though, and to talk about ways to help people provide for their families. All yours, Todd.
Thanks, Jason. I also want to just say a quick word about Senator Gorton and that his passing. People will focus on the service that he did to our state, as Attorney General to our nation, as both senator and a member of the 9/11 Commission investigating that tragedy. But personally, to me, he was also a big Mariners fan and saved the baseball in Seattle many times. So every day we are touched by something that Senator Gorton did for us. Turning to occupational licensing, I want to say that, JT just mentioned the severe economic downturn that we are facing right now. And to get the economy going, it's not simply a matter of reopening the economy. The economy going forward will be different. And we need to remove the friction in the economy that allows people to find new businesses, new jobs, new work, so that they can get back to work because industries are changing. And with that, I want to bring on Representative Vick, who has done a lot of work on removing occupational licenses, getting people who are learning skills, who need new skills, and need the opportunity to find those jobs, but are being locked out because the government is requiring so much time to get that training and get back into the economy. Representative Vick, why don't you talk about that?
Well, thanks, Todd. And a few things that I think we need to dovetail back in on here, as you mentioned, is that to get us out of this financial mess, this COVID mess, we really have to get people back to work. And one way that the state can help is not by just tacking on more money to a paycheck or an unemployment check, but by allowing them the opportunity to get to work earlier. We have been working on occupational licensing in Washington for a few years now. We know that we have a number of licenses that are prohibitive for people getting to work. We know that we have a number of licenses that could be seen as rent seeking to protect current license holders and not allow new competition in. In my district, I have one constituent who really is kind of the example for this. He was an HVAC guy. He lived in Idaho, and he owned a business. He owned a business for 15 years installing central air and heating and air conditioning for folks in homes. He had to move back to Washington. Most people are going the other way right now. But when he moved back for his family issues and moved to Washougal in my community, you know, he went to the Department of Licensing. He wanted to open an HVAC business and was told, well, you need multiple years of apprenticeship and you need to go in and really restart your career. So we took a gentleman who I don't personally know how good of an HVAC tech he is, but to have a 15-year business, he probably was pretty good. The free markets tend to solve those things. This gentleman had to go back and he's still an apprentice, making his way through the process, making about 25% of what he was making in Idaho. That's just one example in one industry. I mean, we could talk about folks who do nails. We could talk about folks who do architecture. We could talk about any variety of careers out there where the state of Washington has, I believe, overstepped their bounds. What we want in occupational licensing is a system where individuals are educated to protect the public. You have the public safety. You don't want diseases spread. You don't want buildings to fall down. You don't want major laws to be violated. But what we don't need is a system that is going to prevent people from ever getting into the profession, prevent competition from coming in. If the skills are there, if we can have aptitude tests, if we can have a whole host of things that make it easier as opposed to, in some cases, years of education on a fairly mundane topic, we make it better for everybody. So as folks move in, as military moves in, as immigrants come in, as prisoners are released from jail and have made their commitment to society, we want to get them back to work, and that's what we're going to keep working on. So I know we've been working together on this, Todd, but happy to hear some more of your suggestions.
Yeah, thank you. I think there's some real opportunities here across the aisle. So one of the things that I think shows how absurd the occupational license burdens are now is that currently, if you want to be a manicurist, you either take 600 or 800 hours of training, many for people who don't have the money to spend that time or spend the money getting the training. But when I got my pilot's license, it took me 50 hours. So after 50 hours, I could fly an airplane around the city of Seattle, but I would have had to do at least another 550 hours if I wanted to do some of these nails. We've also seen the absurdity of these licenses and how disproportionately they harm the poor. Regulation favors the rich and people with connections. And we've seen two examples of that recently. First, for those law students who have finished law school but had not a chance to take the bar, the Supreme Court simply waived the requirement to take the bar exam. And the people that were advocating on their behalf are the heads of law schools, like the head of Seattle University Law School wrote a letter to the state Supreme Court saying we should just waive it. People who don't have connections like that don't get those opportunities. And in fact, the system for licensing in Washington State was transferred from a private sector to the government, and it has been malfunctioning for more than a month. This on top of COVID. So not only have people who are trying to get those licenses, trying to get those jobs, had difficulty getting the training and doing the testing and things like that just because of COVID, the state's computer system that logs their hours and allows them to get the test isn't even working properly. And that, I think, is the real problem with these. And nobody advocates for people who are poor and don't have a voice. They advocate for people who've gone to law school, people who have connections. So there are a number of things that we have recommended that we supported last year. One is legislation that would eliminate the prohibitions on people who have served their time, who have done time in jail for a criminal or other conviction, but are now out and want an occupational license in an area unrelated to their conviction. That passed unanimously out of the House, but was killed in the Senate, unfortunately. We had two other bills, two that got out of committee, one that would have allowed people to take a test to show aptitude. So if you're in a situation like Representative talked about, where you have the skill, you have the aptitude, you can take a test. Right now, we don't allow that. You have to go through the hours, even if you know what you're doing. I had a case where there was a woman from Vietnam who came to the United States, and in Vietnam, she did cosmetology and was actually flown to Paris and around the world by Lancome because she was so good. She came to the United States, could not practice because she didn't have the hours put in. And so here's a person who is just simply wasting money, not learning anything new, but has to do it. And that's the Obama administration put out a very good report talking about how occupational licenses disproportionately hurt low-income immigrants, minorities, things like that, and we need to change that. So I look forward to working on that in the next session. There's those opportunities, and the legislature is the one that needs to do this. The legislature, if it could come back, could waive some of these restrictions now, deal with the problems that people are having now, and then make more permanent solutions in the future. So that's something I hope that we can do in the near term and in the long term. And at this point, I want to turn it over to Mariya to talk about some of the changes that we can make in transportation, some of the things that legislature could do right now to help get the economy back going and make sure that we're spending money wisely. Mariya.
Thank you, Todd. So one of the key issues that I have been tracking over the last couple of years is the Department of Transportation seeking to expand its role as a transportation agency into areas of health, environmental justice, equity. The agency also appears to want to circumvent the legislature by expanding its power in choosing what transportation projects are funded based on kind of this intentionally nebulous ideological framework. And this has been an ongoing effort on the part of the agency, but has become especially apparent during the COVID-19 pandemic, which is shocking because prioritizing mobility and the resiliency and functionality of our state highways will be uniquely urgent during the post-COVID recovery as more people choose to drive. And so at this time, I'd like to invite Representative Andrew Barkis to our screens. Representative Barkis is a local business owner and representative from the 2nd Legislative District. He's also the ranking member on the House Transportation Committee. So I'll turn it over to Representative Barkis to share some of his experiences.
Great. Well, thank you, Mariya, and thank you to the Washington Policy Center for the opportunity to join you today and talk about this important subject, and to my colleagues who are also joining me here. You know, it's important to remember as we talk about the call for the special session that the transportation arena and the budget is in the same boat, literally with the ferry system. That's kind of a bad pun. We have been advocating for a special session too. We're facing about $1 billion, if not more, shortfall that we could be addressing right now. That's going to have a dramatic impact on the people of Washington State and how we get around. So what you're talking about, Mariya, and what we've been seeing as a result of the COVID pandemic is this shift away from what the legislature's responsibility and role is to implement the policies, to appropriate the funds, and then to present that to the agencies to carry out the mission. It's switching, and WSDOT has been doing this over the last couple of years under their secretary. And last year was a great example where there was policy put forth to change the goals by which all things in the department are processed, including goals that had to do with the climate and equity and everything else. And although those may be good, do they really have a role in transportation, in moving of goods and services and people throughout our state safely, and preserving and maintaining the things that we need to do? And we've seen this play out now, where during this pandemic, they're using proclamations and the agency drafting policy as opposed to legislator. And where we're seeing this is example in foregoing or closing down state highways in order to allow for more social distancing or emotional, or how we can get around or help people through this crisis. But what we're not taking into consideration is, what are we doing closing our roads? This is going to be temporary. This is going to be permanent. Does this have constitutional ramifications with the gas tax being used for non-road usage? It's all concerning. And again, this is cutting out the legislature out of the process. And I hear stories from constituents all the time, and I'm glad that Representative Chapman made the comment about how important it is with our constituent inputs. We are the ones. We are the liaison between the people of our districts and the state of Washington to bring that into the House to do the work that we're supposed to do. You cut that out, we can't get the constituents information to the policy. And we see that in, cut and dry with transportation when it comes to projects and needs and maintenance and all these different things. that without the legislature's role in there, that you won't have that connection with our constituents advocating. And I know in the 2nd District, we have several things that we're talking about, whether it's installing roundabouts on very dangerous intersections and everything else. The department would like to have the complete control on this and to be able to make those decisions on prioritizing projects and funding and everything else. And that really does cut out what we're supposed to be doing as members of the legislative body and the Transportation Committee. And I'm very concerned. And I'm concerned that using this crisis to start putting that into play sets a really dangerous precedent. So I'm glad we're discussing this, and I hope that we can get back there soon to put a stop to it.
Thank you, Representative. I'm glad that you mentioned the state transportation policy goals. I think the example that you provided of the agency's recent decision to allow the closure of those Main Street highways is a really practical example of this ideology that they're advocating for in the state transportation policy goals, what that looks like in practice. And so I want to go back to the Department of Transportation's efforts to have more control in terms of policy and funding, which is a great way to kind of, I think, organize this conversation. So when 2 lawmakers proposed this bill, there were actually several bills last session to either change or add to or entirely replace the state transportation policy goals, including the removal of the goal of providing mobility and congestion relief. And Washington Policy Center argued that rather than broadening or changing those existing goals, lawmakers should consider how the current goals can be made more narrow, measurable, and achievable, and we'll be advocating for that again because it's the right thing to do. We don't think that the Department of Transportation should be engaging in public health or social engineering while neglecting its responsibility to improve mobility for all Washingtonians. But the point I want to make on why the Department of Transportation is pursuing changing these policy goals is the objective is to go to a more performance-based evaluation of transportation projects. And so the way that transportation projects would be chosen would not be, ideally, would not be necessarily by lawmakers deciding what their transportation or what their district's transportation needs are, but using the transportation policy goals as a criteria by which to measure whether or not a project should be done or not. And so, for example, the way that would work practically is let's say you have new goals in place in addition to the current goals that we have. So you would look at a highway or a bridge project and you would say, well, does this highway or bridge project increase equity? Does it increase environmental justice? And so you can see when you take mobility and congestion relief out of the equation, how a lot of these critical projects may not get built. And so there is a proviso in last year's budget that directs Department of Transportation to study and evaluate the feasibility of going to these performance-based evaluations, which normally I wouldn't take issue with, but the criteria is not widely agreed upon by the legislature, and by design, the policy goals that the Department of Transportation is pursuing would reduce and manage trips rather than accommodate trips. And so we don't support that shift, especially since the department struggles to meet current goals of reducing congestion, which is its basic job. And so changing state transportation policy goals and going to performance-based evaluations using those goals as a criteria is how WashDOT would effectively gain more power than the legislature in deciding what projects take priority. And so that's kind of the story on the policy end. And on the funding end of the spectrum, the Department of Transportation wants to preserve its flexibility to move money around the state transportation budget set by the legislature. So after the legislature adjourns, the department and the governor can come in and move money around. This is called Fund Transfer Authority, and it has existed since 2005 when the legislature granted the Department of Transportation that authority, but under limited circumstances, to move money from a donor project to a recipient project, assuming that there is no total project cost increase and that there are projects that are drawing on funds slower than what was projected, which would serve as an expenditure offset. So the projects that the department transfers funds to can only be those on a project list that the legislature has approved. And the department can transfer up to $250,000 without approval from anyone. And anything beyond that has to be approved by the governor. The objective, of course, was to give the department the ability to deliver projects efficiently. And generally speaking, that is how the tool has been used. Up until 2019, fund transfers were fairly procedural, uncontroversial. But in researching fund transfers over the years, I found that the department has transferred administratively and with approval of the governor about $290 million over the last decade. And about 51% of that just happened in 2019 alone. So what happened in 2019? Well, in 2019, the governor transferred $175 million out of maintenance and preservation to fund fish culverts. He was unhappy with the amount the legislature appropriated for culverts. And Senate and House transportation chairs, including Representative Barkas, rightly argued that this was a circumvention of the legislature and was not consistent with the intent and historical precedent and letter of Section 601. And so lawmakers recognize, look, we understand we need to fund culverts, we're under a court order, but we want to work together with the executive branch on a strategy to do that, while considering our current obligations, revenue shortfalls, the impact of Initiative 976. And they felt that, and they expressed it in the letter, that the executive branch had bypassed the legislature, which is what Representative Barkas has been talking about. And so this fund transfer tool is a powerful tool. It's never before been abused to this degree and raised a lot of red flags and requires reform. And to that end, Washington Policy Center will be providing policy recommendations that we believe are viable and that will give power back to the legislature where it belongs. So whether that be, on a spectrum of eliminating fund transfer authority or capping how much money can be transferred, which the legislature would decide upon, maybe creating a pre-approval vetting process that includes local entities that could be impacted and reviews donor project delivery before money is transferred out, or my favorite, having lawmakers sign off on the fund transfers rather than having those decisions be made in a vacuum between a governor and a cabinet agency. And so I guess that's kind of the picture on funding. And so when you combine that with DOT's efforts on the state transportation policy goals and performance-based evaluations, you can really see, I think, a more clear picture of where the Department of Transportation is going and why the legislature rightfully feels left out. And so this is something that we'll be continuing to track. And with that, I will pass it over to David.
Thanks, Maria. So before we bring everybody back on for Brady Bunch, I just want a Brady Bunch view of the screen. I just want to review again how this is going to work for the Q&A period. You have an opportunity to ask any questions that you'd like. Just enter them into the question function there on your toolbox. Your GoToWebinar toolbox should probably be on the right-hand side of your screen. Or you can email me at dbose@washingtonpolicy.org. That's D as in David, B as in boy, O, Z as in zebra, E as in egg, dbose@washingtonpolicy.org. And I'll be going through your questions and bring them on to our guests. I'll disappear, so you'll just hear my voice over the other pictures. So if I could bring all of our panelists back on for a video screen, I'll make myself disappear. And I'll start with the first question, which I think is kind of a well-grounded question, and we'll start, I guess, with Representative Wilcox on this, given his position in the legislature. And this is a question about process. What's the process in the Washington Constitution for the legislature to call itself into special session?
Well, I think Jason has probably looked into this more than anybody, but the Constitution envisions two ways. That is the governor calling the legislature in, and oftentimes that's in cooperation with, at the very least, the majority caucuses. And that's happened, as I understand it, every single time. And it seems like I've been involved in every single one of those because we've had, I think, more than 10 in the 10 years that I've been a part of the legislature. And the other way is, I believe, 2/3 of the legislature calling for that. That's never been done. The process is not perfectly spelled out, but a number of members of my caucus have distributed letters. I believe that every member of my caucus has signed those. I think probably every member of the Senate Republican caucus has done that. And Jason, I think, has done us all a service in distributing a letter as well, and keeping track of who signs those things. And as he mentioned earlier, we've got slightly over a majority of the members in the House, but it's a high bar that the Senate calls for.
Yeah, Dave,
Jason, anything to add?
I said Senate.
Yeah, just to follow up on that, the reason why we did our survey was because it does take that 2/3 threshold, and the governor made clear he wasn't going to call a special session. So as Representative Wilcox mentioned, there are at least 51 representatives, there are at least 25 senators. We heard back from 75 of the 149 lawmakers. Nobody said no, but 72 didn't respond.
Next question was, what are the consequences for not calling a special session when it's mandated by law? Isn't it a misdemeanor, and how can the governor not be in legal trouble? Jason, why don't we start with you?
Yeah, so I'll answer this, and then I'll turn it over to Senator Braun, because I know he has thoughts on this. It's not a requirement to call a special session. What the requirement is, and this is part of the Budget and Accounting Act that came out of the problems that we had in the 1980s, and this is a law that Governor Spellman executed, Governor Gregor executed, and what it requires is if there's a cash deficit forecasted, the governor has to order across-the-board cuts unless the legislature has acted. You don't want across-the-board cuts. That's a sledgehammer. There's no thought process, there's no prioritization. You want the legislative branch to come in and have a deliberative, thoughtful response to a budget situation. So that law is to try to incentivize a special session. It doesn't require it. But the fact remains, under it, the word is shall. The governor shall do this. And it is technically a misdemeanor if that law is ignored.
Yeah, if I can just add to that, I agree with everything Jason said. And the law absolutely says shall. And I add that both the Treasurer's Office, State Treasurers, and OFM 2 weeks ago produced documents that said we are in a cash deficit this month. Since then, last week, David Schumacher, the director of OFM, came out with a follow-up letter saying, well, we didn't really mean it. We defined it a little differently, and therefore we don't have to follow law. And by the way, even if it was that, we wouldn't follow law anyhow because we think across-the-board cuts are a bad idea. I couldn't agree more that across-the-board cuts are a bad idea. But the law and the Constitution is pretty clear. The answer is not to disregard the law, it's to call a special session. And it's amazing to me in the world we're in, where rightly or wrongly, there's enormous frustration by the governor because people aren't following his decrees in the form of proclamations from Olympia, and yet he doesn't seem to need to follow the passed and signed law, the statute of the state of Washington. It's somewhat surprising to me that he doesn't see the hypocrisy there. Thanks.
Anybody else want to comment? Okay, moving to the next question. This is for Representative Chapman. Do you feel, how can we get more support from your caucus for a special session?
Well, I think I alerted Jason at some point. If you read the Seattle Times editorials when they were endorsing in the primary, virtually every endorsement where they endorsed the sitting Democrat, almost all of them mentioned their frustration in not having a special session. So some didn't get endorsed, some haven't been interviewed yet by the Seattle Times, and I'm assuming as they move to the general, the rest of those interviews. Seattle Times only interviews, I think, just the I-5, the kind of the Seattle, King County. They don't come out into districts like most of ours that are on this panel, but so I think they should, if you think about it. But it'll be interesting if the rest of my colleagues in their interview process indicate their support for a special session. I just, leadership is about doing what's right, not what you can do. And though I'm probably in a minority on this panel, certainly, not a minority, but the governor has made a career out of criticizing the president's actions. I think you could make a case that their actions have been similar. Now, That's my opinion only, but there's been lack of leadership working with the legislative branch at both the federal and state level. So I'm not one to call the kettle black when my kettle's on fire. It's pretty difficult to criticize the federal government when my own states and districts like mine, Representative Wilcox's, Representative Vick's, Senator Braun's, Representative Barkas, our districts are being obliterated by lack of action on our part. And I think good people are being hurt by these actions. So how do we get the rest of my caucus? Well, hopefully the Seattle Times will push that. Jason's pushed it. He got to 50, which means there were a half dozen or so. And until their districts weigh in, and maybe many of their districts are somewhat satisfied with the leadership that they see out of Olympia, but until their districts weigh in, we may not be able to move many more people.
Hey, Jason, if I could say something, I'm not going to talk about Representative Chapman's caucus, but I will say one of the challenges about communicating this crisis to people is that the consequences so far have been very uneven. Now, that's not going to be true in the long run, because when the budget crisis really hits, those people that have been somewhat insulated from this are going to feel the sting as well. But across the state right now, if you work for a large company, you, in most cases, are still getting paid. You're able to work from home, and other than the isolation, your pocketbook's not being hurt. If you are a public employee, you are not feeling it in your wage, and in fact, in some cases, your work situation may be a little bit easier for you. The pain is concentrated almost exclusively on small businesses and the private economy. And so there are a lot of people that, are rightly concerned about COVID, but at the same time, they're not feeling the other side of the equation, which is the cost of the reaction to COVID. And what really I think is tragic about this whole thing is when we finally do have to adjust the budget, it's all going to come crashing down and everyone will feel the pain. But at this point, it's just not as apparent.
Thank you. Next question is regarding transportation. So Maria, we'll start with you. Has the COVID pandemic changed WSDOT's view on transit priorities?
I don't think so. I mean, the general impression that I get from the Department of Transportation and other transit agencies is they're really trying to stay afloat right now. They believe that the future of travel is still public transit, despite surveys coming out saying more people are planning on.
Sounds like, just a second, Maria. It sounds like someone needs to mute their microphone because we're getting some feedback there. Try it again.
So it seems to me that the goal right now of transit agencies and the Department of Transportation, which is operating more and more like a transit agency, is that we need to preserve public transit to move essential employees as much as possible, despite surveys and data coming out that people are increasingly either planning to telecommute or to drive. So I don't get any kind of impression that anything has changed post-COVID on that front. One of the things that the Washington Policy Center has been advocating for is that transit agencies use this moment, this incredible time of change to reevaluate their transit model and reform how they do business, and be more willing to form creative partnerships to get people around. And so we'll continue to advocate for those reforms.
I would agree, Maria. I tell you, no. The one thing that they're not doing is they're not stopping their continual seeking of funding, especially more so now than ever because of the lack of ridership. You know, we had a really good test and at the beginning in this last session, because we dealt with the Initiative 976. So we, in writing the budget and dealing with transit and such, because their funding comes out of what's called the multimodal fund, which was most impacted by the Initiative 976. We wrote the budget with Initiative 976 passing, so we had about a $450, almost $500 million shortfall to deal with. And it gave us a chance to really push that. And I think the key word is reform and prioritization. So as you're looking at this, and with everything changing as far as work patterns, traffic, et cetera, this is a great opportunity for us as policymakers to look at that. And so that goes back to what we were talking about before. It's dangerous if we don't look at it from a policy standpoint, because if the goals become the filter by which everything is done, it's going to do the opposite. It's going to go to what Representative Vic was talking about when you start to see, and Todd talks about, increase in regulations, increase in cost, increase in time, because using those goals as the filter as opposed to the normal process that we do. So I think it'll be interesting to see what transit, sound transit, rail, all this rail, light rail expansion that's been going on the last many years, ridership. We're seeing this throughout the country, where they're really going to have to reevaluate how transportation works.
Okay, next question. How do we find out which legislators have called for a special session and which have not? I want to know if my legislators have joined, and if not, I'd like to contact them. Jason, why don't we start with you, since it was your survey?
Well, kind of Representative Wilcox mentioned how they have some restrictions in election years on how they communicate. The Washington Policy Center does as well. So while we can report the total numbers that responded, we can't report who responded. So at this point, I just have to encourage you to contact your individual lawmakers to see where they stand.
Next question, directed to Representative Wilcox. From what I've heard, furlough days are not out of the question for public sector workers. What are your thoughts?
Well, they already have imposed a program that includes furlough days. The impact is very small, and I think that it was set up in a way to help them be whole based on some of the provisions in ESD. So yes, there is a little bit of that being done, but it is a drop in the bucket in comparison to the magnitude of the whole problem.
Yeah, if I could add on that question, just support everything JT said. It is the 3% raise that went into effect for state public employees on July 1. The governor had the opportunity to renegotiate that, and it chose not to. So what he did is have that COLA go into effect and recognize that's a COLA, cost of living, supposed to adjust for inflation. Inflation is essentially at 0, and they're getting a 3% raise. And then he said, I'm going to make up that difference by furloughing folks. He only does it through the, for a short period of time. It makes up less than a quarter of the potential savings, and in state employees get an extra 2 weeks off, and they get to apply for unemployment insurance, where if their wage is under 70 grand a year, they actually make more money than they would otherwise. So the net of it is they get, for hours worked, effectively an 8% raise. The state doesn't save any money at all. In fact, it will cost us more money in the end. And the governor pretends he somehow cut the budget and makes, when we come back into special session, whenever, or session next year, the problem that much worse. It was a terrible solution. And I forgot to mention, the public gets less services because when you call on Friday, nobody's at work. Thank you.
That brings us to the next question nicely. This is a question directed to lawmakers. Has the media failed to do its part in advocating for legislative government? You mentioned, or several of you mentioned, a lack of bully pulpit. Shouldn't the media be doing more to be a voice for the legislature?
Sure, I'll chime in. Yeah. I think it's interesting that I think the media is doing somewhat, and as Representative Wilcox indicated, we have a big challenge because we can't communicate due to the election year restrictions. And people ask all the time, what are you doing? What are you doing? And, you know, social media is what, 2-3%, 4%. It's not as big as people think it is as far as getting the information out. And I think it would be good that if the media asked very simple questions. For example, I get asked this all the time. Doesn't the governor talk to you every week? Don't you get briefings? And when I say to them, the governor has never, not once, done like we're doing right here, virtually, addressed the legislature. He's never called us into any kind of meeting, never addressed us. For what I know, has never pulled a cabinet together of the leadership of the legislature, not once. We do get occasional briefings from staff, but never from the governor directly. I think that speaks to Representative Chapman's concerns about leadership and this time where a bipartisan solution to a crisis is necessary. So the media could ask those kind of questions and maybe do a little bit more to get this word out, maybe even push the agenda of the importance. I was glad to see the Seattle Times finally weigh in on the importance of a special session and kind of advocate for that. And I hope that that continues because this is an important thing that we're talking about today, and the people do need to know about it in the state of Washington.
Anybody else?
Let me add something to that. I'm actually quite appreciative that across the state, there's been a ton of editorial comment that has been pretty pointed and demanding in agreeing with the point that every panelist here is making, that you know, we live in a state that's supposed to be governed by 3 branches. They're supposed to be co-equal, and in a crisis, instead of dividing, we should be uniting and finding the things that we can agree on in common. I think that's been a really good point by editorial boards across the state. Now, the governor has done a good job of ignoring that. And it would be great to see more questions, I think, at his press conferences. I mentioned that he has a big microphone right now. And all of us have a tiny little piece of social media. So he is totally outweighing us in terms of the heft of the message that he can send. And the only way to counteract that is for the news department, as opposed to the editorial section of the press, to begin demanding answers. And I actually think that they have not shirked at pointed questions. But I think as we go farther along and more people feel the consequences of the reaction to COVID, they will begin being much more pointed in their questioning in this regard.
I'd like to add, so the media recently, and I'm not sure, it's probably a couple of weeks now, the media did ask the governor about special session. And I have to be honest, I was incredibly offended. He made a flippant statement as along the lines of, I don't need a bunch of legislators speechifying. I represent almost 3 counties, which is out of 39, not an insignificant number of piece of real estate in this state. And I'm going to argue that I've spent hundreds, if not thousands of hours in my district over the last 4 years, a hell of a lot more than the governor ever has. And you guys know me, I'm not exactly a speechifier, but I'd like to think that when I do say something in Olympia, I'm representing my district the way that I feel it wants to be represented. I get it that, you know, big chunks of my district don't agree with me, but I was offended at that. That's not leadership. That's kind of dictatorial, my way or the highway. 49 districts have representation. Most of it is unified representation in that it's all Republican or all Democrat, but we all work hard for our districts. And I was on a Zoom call the other day, and I mentioned how much I respect my colleagues across the aisle, that they have their beliefs and they represent their district who elects them. And that is what is missing with the governor's approach. He forgets that JT and Andrew represent their district, and they have a lot of 125 to 150,000 constituents relying on them. They're not going to show up in Olympia and just be about speeches. They're going to show up in Olympia and work hard on behalf of their district to make sure that the budget cuts are reasonable, will work for their district, and they're going to fight like hell, like they always do, for the people they represent. That's what I would have liked the governor to accept and respect. And that should be bipartisan frustration. That was highly offensive and somewhat was dismissive of the electorate who elects us and who has elected us and will either elect us or not elect us here in a few weeks. It was just wrong. And that's not leadership. That's just get out of my face. I don't want these people around. And that's why I'm raising the flag. I'm suspicious come January what his approach will be with regards to the legislature. I'm the only one, I believe, that has raised concern about what the role he will allow the role will be in Olympia come January. And I think that that is something that should be being asked right now. But I'm an outlier, I think, on that one.
Well, it kind of relates to the next question for legislators. What can legislators of the public do to challenge Governor Inslee on possible illegal transfers of funds to cover the cash shortfalls?
Well, I'll try to take that. I don't know that the governor or OFM can, it's hard for me to imagine how they would illegally transfer funds to cover the cash shortfall. What they're attempting to do is simply define the cash deficit in a way that allows them to say that it doesn't exist. And I think the law is pretty clear. I think prior practice is pretty clear. I think the governor is absolutely wrong that there is a cash shortfall. And frankly, there's only two things. As long as he's willing to flaunt the law, and he appears willing, I think there's only two things that stop him. One is litigation from either the legislature, which I think the current majorities are not likely to do, or from the private, from a private citizen or a legislator as a private citizen. Certainly a possibility. The other is for folks to, choose differently in November. Those constitutionally are the ways you address this issue.
Hey, Dave, very briefly, I can address part of that. The treasurer's office, I was asking the treasurer's office, how are you paying the bills if there's not enough cash right now in the general fund? And what happens is they will basically take a loan out from other accounts to pay the bills, but then that money is owed back with interest. So the problem is getting worse because now we're owing interest payments on the cash deficit we have each month.
Thanks, Jason. Next question is regarding occupational licensing. They say hey, it's too complicated, yes, but how do you unwind it? Now, doesn't it just reflect a part of the red tape clog hitting Washington? And didn't Senator Braun report that regulations were out of control in Washington in a publication a couple of years ago? So I guess we'll start with you, Todd, about how do you unwind occupational licensing, and then we'll get Senator Braun's response to how it relates to regulations at large.
The same way you eat an elephant, one bite at a time. I think that you just have to take bit by bit. Representative Vick offered 4 different bills to deal with different aspects of occupational licensing. So there's lots that we can do. I think that there are clearly some licenses that simply need to go away because they can't be reformed. I think that's very unlikely, however. So what I think is that you can provide alternatives. There is a concern about safety. So the justification, I should say, that we have a lot of occupational licenses is for safety. But we have seen that that has been abused. In fact, in 1907, the Washington State Supreme Court examined licenses for barbering. And of course, the justification was safety. But the dissent, which was wonderful, pointed out that most of the rules in that law had nothing to do with being a barber, and that the law was about making it difficult for African Americans to be barbers. It was implemented in a racist way, and we see that. So you're not going to get rid of that overnight. So what you need to do is bit by bit make little changes, allow people who have skills to get licenses without the hours, allow people, remove the barriers for people who have served their time and then want to get a job rather than going, getting back into the bad habits and going back to jail. Those sorts of things are how you make progress.
Just to tag onto that real quick, I think we had 6 bills as a caucus, 4 of mine and 2 from other members. And what I guess I want to relay is that there is hope on this one. We worked these bills very well. I wrote them with Department of Licensing. We had complete buy-in out of our committees. The subject matter of the bills is not the problem on this one. The Senate did have a problem with the one that made it over there, or I don't think they had a problem. I think we had a timing issue. And the reason I say that is these aren't bills that have lobbyists. These aren't bills that have, paid people going door to door to gather votes. This is a true grassroots movement. And so I think when we go back and we reintroduce these and we have more items along this line, we're going to need help from folks calling up and saying, we want to get back to work, help us pass these bills. It's a priority for the regular folks, not just the paid folks.
Yeah, and just a reminder that the bill that made it over to the Senate passed 98-0. So this is, obviously very bipartisan. Representative Kirby, who was the chair of the committee, did a great job of ushering it through his committee and making sure that the language was acceptable to all. So I think there's real opportunity.
Hey, and if I can just jump in before somebody else talks, because you mentioned my name, and yes. I think somebody is referring to an Economic Sense article I published clear back in January of 2016. In that session, I had a bill that would have required all new rules put into place by the state government to come before the legislature in a package, and we would have to affirm them essentially, or they would expire. It was a great way to get after the pages and pages of rules we make every year to make our citizens' lives harder. Is modeled after a law that's in place in Colorado. It's done on a bipartisan basis, and frankly, if we'd had a Republican governor in Washington for the last 40 years, the Democrats would be running this bill. It's the right bill for regular people that say, oh, they can't keep up with the number of rules that are laid on top of them every year. So not to take away anything from the great work they're doing on occupational licensing, they are absolutely on the right path, and I think that will ultimately be successful in both chambers. But I really appreciate whoever had that question and pulling a nice paper from the past to the present. Thank you.
I think it's time to bring it. I think it's time to bring it back, Senator. Here's one little add-on to this, what we're seeing now too. Not only is it the normal enormous amount of rules being made, but every proclamation that's being put forth by the governor under this emergency order is also adding to additional rulemaking that's happening by these agencies in order to implement the proclamations and prohibitions that are under this emergency order, many of which, as well as we do, become permanent over a long period of time. Think about L&I and some of these other things, making it harder and harder for those working and the common person to deal with stuff. I'm in business, many on this call are in business, and we're dealing with that right now as it relates to COVID and even more rulemaking.
Well, we're just about out of time, but since we started a bit late, I'm going to ask just one more question. This is regarding transportation. We keep hearing about roads being closed. Is that legal? Were the roads funded to become private cafes? How is this possible?
That's a great question. That was one of my questions as well. I think I imagine it is legal under the COVID emergency. And so the Department of Transportation is using emergency authority to reallocate these lanes and also close parking to hand over that right of way to bicyclists, pedestrians, and restaurants. And I would imagine it is legal, but I don't think it's right. Yeah. And I don't think it shows a lot of foresight, especially as a lot of these temporary programs the ultimate objective is to make permanent.
So we checked, as a ranking member, I checked with staff. We had staff talk to our OPR, other staff. I mean, we asked that question because there are 18th Amendment. It's a constitutionally protected use of gas tax that everybody pays, and it's supposed to go to roads and transportation related. So creating, sidewalk cafes, et cetera, they're using the same pretense as all the other things. It's temporary, right? It's 90 days. We're just going to do this for 90 days, but there's no real precedence on this. So as Senator Braun says, we have no way of challenging this unless we challenge it in the court of law, or we come back and legislate different policy. I mean, this is what we're faced with. And this is a really good example, again, because they say it's temporary, but they said the same thing about the eviction moratorium. By the very nature, a moratorium should be temporary. 30 days to solve the problem, present the solution, move on. Not 9 months of new policy impacting a giant segment of our economy.
Yeah, and let me back up Andrew in this a little bit. You know, I think one of the very worst things that is going to happen over the next few months due to the abuse of the state of emergency and the unwillingness to bring the legislature in is these things that in some cases are the right approach for a very limited period of time will be almost impossible to unwind. The consequences get bigger every day of unwinding these things. And I think when we talk about the consequences to the rental housing market, there is nothing bigger in our state. Before this emergency, that was the biggest catastrophe in our state. And every single day that we go through this system that is destroying private ownership of rental housing, we are creating an emergency that is going to be almost, in fact, a catastrophe that is going to be harder to unwind every day.
Well, on that happy note, we'll have to end this particular conference. There's a number of questions that were left unanswered. For those of you familiar with joining us on our virtual solution series events, we always go back and try to answer those questions, and then we post them as a blog or get back to you. So be watchful of that. Be sure to check the dates coming up for our next panel that will be with Dr. Roger Stark about his new book. You can read about it at washingtonpolicy.org. I want to thank each of our panelists, Senator Braun, Representative Chapman, Representative Vick, Representative Marcus, Representative Wilcox. It's been a pleasure to have you on. A very, very big panel, the most complicated I think that we've tried to run so far. And of course, our Center Directors, Todd Myers for the Center for the Environment, Jason Mercier, Center for Government Reform, and Mariya Frost with the Coles Center for Transportation. Thank you as well. We appreciate your comments and feedback. Be sure to send us those comments. You can email me directly, dbose@washingtonpolicy.org. And we hope you'll join us for our next virtual solution series and sign up for our annual dinner, which is also going virtual as a single statewide event on September 25th. It's going to be a very, very fun, very active, and very engaging event. So go to washingtonpolicy.org and learn about that. Thank you and have a great day.
Thank you.
Thanks.